Welcome back. We're talking about the potential changing global economic order. Let's get back to our panel now, and let's get to John Sitilides in New York. And John, one surprising omission from the Standard Chartered report is that the United Kingdom does not make the top 10. Does that surprise you?
Well, it doesn't surprise me if we talk about the purchasing power parity, but in terms of market exchange rates, yes, it's a very strange prediction. And again, it's a very dangerous business, not personally or physically, but it's very easy to go wrong because we can't anticipate crises. Look, for instance, what happened to Brazil over the last decade. It was one of the promising BRICS countries of the prior decade, and it went through terrible political and economic crises, and now we have a very different type of governing system there. We don't know what will be happening in some of the powerhouse countries where China seems to be putting off reforms and economic liberalization. India still has very serious problems. The need for reform to open up the country to FDI, to shake off corruption, to shake off an inefficient bureaucracy. The UK, I think a lot will depend on what happens in its Brexit negotiations. How clean will the break be? And how will Europeans, and for that matter, other markets, then view London as a finance capital of the global economy, depending on how Brexit is negotiated?
Yan Wong, there is another view on this Standard Chartered report. The Financial Times says in an opinion piece that China may be the world's #1 economy by 2030, but that is by no means certain. The newspaper's economic commentator says one cannot use the country's economic performance over the last 4 decades as an indicator of where it's going to go. What do you make of that?
Well, I think obviously, as John just mentioned, you cannot predict crisis. So obviously, there is a risk that China, something may happen in China, then the economic miracle just ends. So it's possible, but in my opinion, it's very unlikely. Think about again. I think the size of population plays the dominant role here. So think about Chinese per capita GDP. It's only $10,000 US. That's per capita GDP reflects per productivity of the country. And the US per capita GDP is $60,000 US. So it means that the productivity of China is less than 13% of the US level. And obviously there's a lot of room for this to improve. So if China is able to achieve the 20% or 25% of US productivity level, then the size of the Chinese economy will be just bigger. So to me, I think I have no doubt that will happen.
Okay. Ravi Ramamurthy, if we take a closer look at this report, it also says that Brazil will make the top 10. John Sitilides just mentioned Brazil. But given Brazil's political turmoil right now and the very anemic growth rate, do you see it making a big, major turnaround in the next decade?
I don't think so. I think Brazil has always been a country with a promise of bright future, but the future keeps slipping away. I think the new president, who seems to be determined to make some fundamental reforms, there may be an uptick in the rate of growth, but Brazil has really been stuck in the middle income trap for a long time. And even in the go-go years of the emerging markets, when Brazil did catch spark and grow at a somewhat faster clip, it was not nearly as fast as even China will be able to grow going forward. So I think Brazil has some fundamental challenges. It is still too commodity dependent. Its political system is still very cumbersome. Inequality is a huge problem in Brazil, and lots of social tensions, which are going to have to be handled. So I'm a little surprised by the projections that has Brazil being up there in the top 5 or 6 by 2030. I think a lot of this just depends on what assumptions you make about rates of growth. And I have to keep emphasizing, when you measure things in PPP terms, the emerging markets all look a lot better than they do if you measure them at market exchange rates. Now, it's important when you think about standard of living of people in the country, the PPP measure is a good measure. So when you say China's per capita GDP is only $10,000, in PPP terms, it's $20,000. And in the US, it's $50,000 or $60,000. So it tells you that the actual standard of living of people, on average, in the emerging markets has improved significantly. And that is not something to be ignored. But it doesn't mean that their role in the global economy is as high as these numbers would indicate.
Right. John, if we look at this changing pecking order, and this is a bit of a political question here, do you see the strategic balance in the world changing? Do you see economic power translating, say, into changing military postures around the world?
Potentially. That really, I think, is going to hinge on the U.S.-China relationship and then the way that India and China balance each other in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think also we're looking, again, if you look at the trend lines, it's difficult to say which predictions are accurate, but the trend lines are generally accurate, Anand. And what you see over the last several decades is Spain has dropped off the top 10, Italy has dropped off, France has dropped off, per your question before, the UK will drop off, and only Germany will remain from a European perspective. And so you see the decline of Europe in relative terms compared to both the United States and to rising Asian and, for that matter, Middle Eastern economies. But I think much of the world geopolitical framework will hinge on the way in which the U.S.-China relationship is balanced in the next several decades.
Perry Wong, do you see China's economic growth change the way it behaves in the world, its influence in the world? Some might call it soft power. But do you see expanding Chinese influence?
I think it's already there. But I think the real question is how successful Chinese government or the nation can be in influencing on the global stage. I think that goes back to the very fundamental issue on economic growth or the orientation of the economy. So if the Chinese economy can escape successfully the middle income trap, so the economy will be innovative base, productivity growth driven, and it's an open economy. And so if by then we can get to that stage, by the way, not many countries can escape the trap.
Right.
There are only few of them, particularly they are all small, and politically they are weak in that sense. So if China can get there, yeah, I can see the political order would change, I would say almost automatically. But if a country merely reflect its muscle on pure size, which I don't think that would go very smoothly.
Yan Wang, if we look at the last century right now, I mean, the major influence around the world has been European and North American. But according to the Standard Chartered report, Asia will account for 35% of world growth by 2030, up from 28% last year and up from 20% in 2010. What is the significance of that change?
I think maybe two things. One is it will create a lot of business opportunities, not only for Asian business people, but also for all around the world. Asia as a whole are much open economies than North America, than Europe, than Africa. So I think the first point is that this will be a positive development for the world. The second, I think, again, we need to put this in the proper perspective. I think if we always emphasize on the size of the Chinese economy is becoming the largest one in the world, I think that is not entirely helpful because that actually will invite external pressure to contain China. So I think we need to put this in proper perspective. The U.S., Europe, even though the size of the economy will be slightly smaller than the Chinese economy in 10, 15 years, but they will remain the most advanced economy. They will remain the role model that China should try to develop into.
Ravi, what are your thoughts on that, the fact that Asia could be the region which will be responsible for a little over a third of global output by 2030?
I think it takes us back a couple of centuries when that was in fact already the case. So for the last 2 centuries or so, we've seen the center of gravity of the global economy shift northward and westward, but it's in the process of shifting back to where it used to be about 1600s. And I think that is the way it's going to be. As the previous speaker mentioned, Asia will represent a huge opportunity, but it's also its voice in the global economy and the management of the global system will have to increase in some commensurate fashion. China and India are both pressing for that, and that I think they're unified in wanting to have a greater voice for the emerging economies. You've seen the rise of the BRICS summit as one example of trying to voice that. You've seen the rise of the G20, which has several players from Asia as part of the club of G20. So I think the voice of the Asian countries will increase. It will create some tensions between those countries and the West. But there is also, of course, potentially a struggle between China and India for influence in the region and to speak on behalf of the emerging markets. That will also be playing out in these years. So I think it's going to be a tumultuous period.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.